Okay, we have the pleasure here today of having a real guest, Jeffrey Bishop, who is really a diner aficionado. He's taken pictures and studied a whole history of diners, and apparently it's such a small world that he actually was aware of Betty Roof's Diner, which was in Wysox for a while. So let me switch it over to you. And tell us about a little bit about yourself and how you got into this whole thing.
I started to develop a real love for the American diner during my high school, prep school years at Solbury School in New Hope, Pennsylvania, when I ran on the cross-country team. And we used to stop in the diner in the evening after we'd run the cross-country meets. They were usually run on a Wednesday, midweek in the late afternoon, or on Saturdays at halftime of football games. And my prep school, Solbury, was located in New Hope, Pennsylvania, and we were members of what we called the Penn Jersey League at the time. And it ran many schools in New Jersey: Morristown, Friends, the Hun School, Perkiomen, for some. And I always recall the late, the evenings at the diners.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was a milkshake, French fries, and a hamburger for $1. This is in 1964, 65, and 66. And I had always used to fantasize about being able to spend a Saturday night at one of these diners with a lady, at home,
Mm-hmm.
with whom I had a high school crush.
Oh yeah.
And never, and missed her terribly, and wanted to be able to, be with her. So I had this, romantic, attachment to diners. And then, since after prep school, I went to school for a year in New Orleans,
Mm-hmm.
and then Youngstown, Ohio, where I'm from.
Okay.
And then I lived in Western Mass, and I was in and out of school, unsettled. Went through a terrible bout of depression.
Mm-hmm.
Very directionless. Hospitalized myself 3
Wow.
times for depression. And the third time was a long-term hospitalization in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And it was there that among the therapy, there was a great arts and craft part of the program,
Mm-hmm.
right on Main Street in Stockbridge, called the Lavender Door,
Mm-hmm.
which is still there, of course, today. And they had a darkroom there.
Uh-huh.
And I was given a camera, Canon camera, as a gift by my girlfriend at
Mm-hmm.
the time. And looking back to my summer camp days as an adolescent, 10, 11, 12, I always enjoyed photography with my Brownie camera. And consequently, used to like shooting images.
Mm-hmm.
And never really took the interest any farther during my high school years, etc. I was also an avid American stamp collector, and I still
Okay.
am. So I'm a philatelist of American U.S. stamps. And I have a great love for the American visual artists, especially the painters, and especially the 20th century, the mid-20th century. Among my favorites are Charles Birchfield and Fairfield Porter, Edward Hopper. More modern, the American photorealists, Richard Estes, for instance, Ralph Goings, and John Bader. And John Bader, who is still, I believe, an active painter, published 2 books on his watercolors. Most watercolors. Some, I may be wrong here. Watercolors and oils of the American diner.
Right.
John Bader, being what I feel is one of the more lyrical of the photorealists, and captured, the American diner in tremendous affection.
Okay.
Living in Columbus, Ohio during the 1970s, I went back to Ohio State and started to take courses in the photography department. And it was during that time that I saw one of John Bader's first book on diners in the late 70s at a bookstore. And it reminded me so much, looking at the images, of the way I felt in prep school. And so I thought at some point I'd love to go back and track some of these diners down. However, referring to, when I started photography was during my last hospitalization in Stockbridge. I started to work in the darkroom, and at that time, of course, with my love of the American painters, I thought about combined with my growing up in Youngstown, Ohio, with my Great Lakes palette that I call steel mills and railroads and coal yards and dreary winters, but lake effect snow, and combining that with my father's family's residence in Lehighton, Pennsylvania, in Carbon County. I grew up with a real mid-20th century palette, as I call it.
But this photography, this darkroom, had some therapeutic...
tremendous therapeutic. And it was one day I'm visiting another patient, and he had a record album of a blues, jazz person. I don't remember who it was, but I remember the cover of the record album being a photograph of the L in Chicago on a winter day.
Okay.
And it just occurred to me, why don't I pick up a camera and go out and photograph all this phenomena of the 20th century of America that I like so much. Just hit the road, photograph the mill towns, the railway yards, working in industrial neighborhoods, and the night places, and then I thought in the diners, in the eating places, and that's what I started to do. I didn't start photographing the diner until in the late 80s.
Okay.
I had moved to New Orleans for about 7 years after Columbus, and upon my return to the Northeast, when I moved with my wife to Connecticut, of course, then I was within range, and I started to photograph diners. And of course, at this time, this began the period of the demise of the American diner, for all the reasons that we talk about in the industry. But American diners were disappearing very quickly, so I began photographing what diners I could find and the neighborhoods. And with my sense of the American manufacturing and this small manufacturing American town and the disappearing of the factory, and coupling this with my sense of the aloneness of the American experience.
Well, you felt an immediacy that you had to do something to preserve it or capture it.
Yes, I wanted to capture, for myself,
right,
what was left, what was happening, so that because they were going quickly, and as the steel mills went in Youngstown, which was my other great love, and as as much of our industrial mid-20th century was going, the diner seemed to be a classic symbol of the American industrial century, and they were disappearing quickly. So my photography of the American diner is stressing very much the diner in its last hurrah, and and in the neighborhoods, and the diners as they exist, as the diners as they're altered, as they're changed, as they're disappearing, those that are have emerged and trying to survive, as they're becoming a real anachronism. So as with my other American landscape work, I have a sense, I believe, a sense of a quiet melancholiness to my work, and aloneness, and that part of the diner interests me. And that the glory days of the diner, of John Bader's early paintings, and his many of those diners, of course, are gone.
Well, Norman Rockwell did some diner work. Didn't he show with a cop and a few things and that?
Yeah, Norman Rockwell, of course. I have tremendous respect for Norman Rockwell for his his illustrations of America.
Trying
He
to
really did.
capture the essence of what we were.
Yes, he did very successfully, and he's noted for that.
And yet there's a group of people who really try to demean him
There were
and trivialize him.
Yes, but that's gone now. Thankfully, he's regarded. In fact, I many years later, after I was able to get myself to go back to school again and finish my degrees, very late, and I studied for part of my undergraduate degree at a small art college in Hamden, Connecticut, illustration college called Pair College of Art, spelled P-A-I-E-R, College of Art after the family. And I studied with a man by the name of John Filato,
Okay.
who had a tremendous respect for Norman Rockwell and used to communicate with him. And John Filato was a very, very tight, hyper-realist landscape painter.
Okay, we're on.
And so we've talked a lot about Norman Rockwell. Now I teach at Pair. I'm an adjunct instructor at Pair College of Art, and John Filato is still there. And he is 8 years older than myself, and we still so we share a lot and go to lunch. So
that's great.
I studied under him, and so he still I spend time and show him my drawings, and we talk art and we critique, and so he still helps me, and we share a lot together. So now we're compatriots, and we talk much of Norman Rockwell. When I lived in Stockbridge, I was at the Austin Riggs Center for treatment, and Norman Rockwell and his wife moved to Stockbridge.
Really?
For because of treatment too at Austin Riggs. And I used to see Norman Rockwell ride his bicycle up and down, Main Street in Stockbridge. I never stopped to talk with him because I was always afraid to bother him. I was afraid probably many people would pester him. So I didn't. I regret not being able to, because John Filato told me that he was a very amiable man. And but he has his museum there and had his studio there, and many people now regard him as a seriously fine artist of American culture.
Now, getting back just away from diners for a second, you've had some pretty exciting photographic journeys around the world.
Yes.
Now, at what point did you get into that?
I decided I've always had a tremendous love of history. As a kid, in grade school, I was with my friends, my whole class with big Civil War buffs. I have a tremendous interest in American history, and consequently, then European history and world history, and particularly the modern Middle East, to add to that. And I started to gain a tremendous interest in places of festering problems and ongoing revolution. So in the early 80s, very early 80s, I thought to myself, why can't I just pick up and take my camera and drop myself into some of these places and experience it? So I did just that. I went to Northern Ireland twice in 1982 and 1984 and photographed the Troubles in Derry and in Belfast, but I did it very much as a fine art photographer. I was doing it for myself. And then I went into Beirut during the Lebanese Civil War in 1982 and photographed extensively in the Palestinian camps. The last trip I took on this level was to Ethiopia to photograph some of the effects of that horrific famine in 1984. And since then I haven't traveled at all out of the country. So it's been 30 odd years since I've gone overseas. Most of it due to money. My wife got the job in Connecticut, and we moved to Connecticut and bought a house.
And that's your current address now? Or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And how long have you been there?
In North Haven since 1988.
Wow, that's a long.
It seems like yesterday for me.
It is yesterday.
It is, so we're in Connecticut, and the expense of Connecticut and having a house and jobs, all of a sudden years turn into decades, and I'm now 67 and probably too old, and probably don't, and I'm sure I don't have the guts anymore to do those kind of trips.
But you still have enthusiasm.
Oh, I'd love to do it.
You mentioned Ethiopia. I saw a guy on TV, and he was growing mangrove trees in Ethiopia, and he was taking bags of iron filings and fertilizer, poking holes and burying them as he planted these plants. And the deal was down there, that he was growing mangrove trees and he was feeding the leaves to goats. And so he was converting salt water, or brackish water,
Yes.
into food and
Yes.
milk
Yes.
and fabric or textiles, I
Yes.
guess, from the, what do you call. And I contacted him. He wanted me to come down there, and I was seriously thinking about helping him out. And then I found out that they have these roving gangs of people. They go and just wipe everybody out.
You have to be very careful. Ethiopia today, you know, I was there during a horrible regime under Mengistu, you know, which was he was an ally of the, he was a communist bloc nation,
Mhm.
but he was a radical agrarian communist like Mao Zedong and Pol
Mhm.
Pot, and to see food being wasted, thrown away at the Hilton in Addis Ababa during a wedding, and yet just a few miles north, a horrific starvation,
Yeah.
and the money spent on political posters on the military was upsetting. But now, from what I understand, you know, Ethiopia is involved in much war and gangs and
Oh, yeah.
control, and you have to be very careful that, you know, Eritrea and Tigray province, which we're in, and you know, Eritrea now is a separate nation, and they have a horrible situation.
Well,
as
call
far as
me
human
chicken
rights.
and yell and all that, but I said, you know, I've come too far along to get snuffed out and not even know why.
Right.
You know?
Well, I too. You know, if I were to go back to Beirut today, I'm sure it would be an instant death sentence. From what I understand, because you have at that time, even though I had no press credentials, I had a camera. Many people automatically saw me that I was a journalist, and there was you know, some thought, you know, for the American public to show the problems in the Middle East to the American public. Now, you know, America, an American passport would just be most likely a dangerous situation, any lawless area with the infiltration of you know, jihadist movements that survive on the poor, the uneducated, the unemployed, the dispossessed, and of course that would include Beirut's refugee camps, which today I believe are full of Syrians.
Okay, we're back on. I was very moved about your interfacing or interaction with the Italian groups here that actually took you under wing and kind of
Yes.
showed some sort of concern for you.
In Beirut, I was spending much time on foot, photographing in the Shatila and Sabra Palestinian camps, and at that time, the Italian and the French soldiers and British soldiers were present as peacekeepers, I believe. I know the Italians and French certainly were, and I ran into Italian soldiers quite frequently in jeeps. And one rainy afternoon, an Italian jeep of soldiers picked me up and took me to the headquarters of their captain, and he warned me that where I was walking and spending my time was extremely dangerous, and that I would be killed. And he said, he took the information from my passport. He said, so that when you are killed, I can contact your State Department. And he said, advised me not to do that, to walk around that area. And he showed me a huge map of the south of Beirut, which was loaded with different colored pins representing different incidents, military incidents that were happening, and, you know, incidents of violence and exchanges between different factions and the peacekeepers, or different factions in themselves. And he told me that if I wanted to continue to photograph there, maybe I could ride with his soldiers. And I said, I'm making better contact by going on foot, and I know it's more dangerous, so I continue to go on foot.
Wow.
So that's what I did. And most, I think, dangerous part of the trip is when I found a driver to take me up to Tripoli, Lebanon,
Okay.
which is a center of was the center of in northern Lebanon, a center of you know, the Salafist jihadism in the
Well, that was
Middle East.
the Barbary pirates.
Yeah, at one time.
At
yeah.
one time.
Well, no, that was Tripoli, Libya.
Okay.
Yeah, this
There's
is
more than one
Tripoli,
Tripoli.
Lebanon.
Okay.
And it was a center of you know, a lot of jihadist movements, Sunni. And at that point, you had what was left of the PLO, and the Syrians and locals were fighting in Tripoli, because of course the Syrians at one time, Lebanon was part of Syria, and Syria was run by the Alawite family of the Assads. And and the Sunnis were fighting the Syrians up there. But as an American, as soon as I got out of the car, I was warned not to go, of course, by everybody, that I ran into in Beirut. But I found a driver to take me, and I got out of the car, and I could tell how instantly I was horrifically hated. The look on people's faces, etc. Obviously being an American with my gestures and my clothing, etc. And as the shooting began, and the fighting began in a building that was just door to door and window to window, I had a driver, and they ran up to me and said, "We're going to leave here right now, go back to Beirut. If you don't come with me, you're on your own. You walk back." But, he
at least he granted you that courtesy.
Oh, he
right?
did. He was so anxious to get out of there, and we got out, and as we heard, within 45 minutes, Syrian jets bombed Tripoli, and he got me out just in time.
Now these are areas where, when you talk about food resources, we're not talking like easily grown food and resources to survive.
Well, in Lebanon, yes, food was in abundance.
Really?
One thing I had, even in the Palestinian camps, was some of the freshest food. The vegetables.
Where'd they grow it?
They grow it, everywhere. Because Lebanon had a climate. It was very rainy in December.
Okay.
In the areas along the sea, just like Israel, you could grow a lot of. It's a lot like Southern California. So you can grow a lot of different foods and vegetables. So that's why if you go to a Lebanese restaurant here in the United States, the food is so good. The use of vegetables, the fruits, the fish, the chicken.
Okay.
It was phenomenal.
All right.
So it was strange here being in Beirut in these camps, with the poverty, the destroyed buildings, the utter poverty, the sewage in the streets, but yet the food was fresh and under Islamic law. Of course, anything that was slaughtered had to be slaughtered freshly. So they fed me. The Arab hospitality was incredible. And during rainy days, I remember the Palestinian refugees with the hummus and the pita bread and the vegetables and the olives.
Sounds good.
They were good to bring out, and the tea they would bring out. And they would insist that I sit down under an awning, and they would stand in the rain. This is incredible, hospitality, and I was then started to feel. I began to feel welcome. Maybe I wasn't. It's always potentially dangerous.
Sure.
But in the refugee camp, that's why I wanted to continue going on foot. And I think I was just lucky that I didn't step on something that somebody didn't discharge their M16 into my belly or blow my brains out with their handgun. I think I was just very, very lucky. But I tried to go back in 1983, and of course the de facto Lebanese government then no more visas. I couldn't get a visa. I did in 1982, I think, because of all the chaos. I probably assumed I was a journalist in 1983. Because I wasn't a journalist, I couldn't get it. And I asked the Baltimore Museum of Art to write a letter to the Lebanese embassy, which they did do.
Okay.
Because the Baltimore Museum of Art had collected a bunch of my work from Northern Ireland and Beirut from the 1982 expedition. And I sent, in 1983, they sent a letter, attesting to my photographic interest, etc. Still, I couldn't get the visa to go back. And at that time, of course, West Beirut, where I was going to stay, had fallen to the Shiites.
Okay, let's get back to the diners, and where have you actually traveled to photograph and really research this whole diner thing?
Well, of course, there was for a while, in fact, in large part due to, I believe, I may be wrong, this is my thought, to Ralph Going and especially John Bader's, really beautiful paintings of diners. That there was a resurgence in interest in diners from other architectural, American roadside architectural organizations, and even to the point where there was a conference held in I believe Fraser, Pennsylvania, right near Philadelphia, on the American diner for about 3 days, put by an American Association of Architectural Interests, and I'm trying to remember the name of the organization, but I think it was called the American Association of Roadside Architecture, something like that.
Well, the Red Rose Diner is some listed with some historically in some historic buildings in Pennsylvania, anyhow. Yeah. So
the Red Rose Diner and consequently And there was a magazine that was published called Roadside Magazine for a few years. And I kept all my copies. Then it was changed to By the Way. They went out of business, and they used to. Yes, their reporter used to go around and interview diner owners and go to keep up with diners. And so between that and Ralph Going's book, The American Diner Then and Now, and then there was the Diner Museum that put out books. I have the roadside, all the roadside maps and the roadside books, guides on American diners, which of course is very outdated now. But I began to hunt them down, what was left. And because I love driving the back roads of America and doing the urban American landscape.
Right.
So I would just look for diners and make a list if I saw any, altered or whatever condition, wrecked, deserted, being restored, on-site diners, individuals, as joint, or what I call joints. And so began making a long list. And many times I go and revisit many of these. And for instance, in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is the home of the Worcester Lunch Car Company,
right.
There's a beautiful diner that's been kept in the family for decades and decades and decades called the Boulevard Diner. It's a 1936 Worcester Lunch Car, absolutely in impeccable condition, like this, incredible. And they stay within the family. I think they're on the National Historical Register. There is the Miss Worcester diner, that sits across the street from what was the factory that made those diners.
Right.
The building is still there. But I've seen so many disappear, like in the New Haven area. They all disappeared except for one, which was moved from Ansonia. I saw so many diners disappear in the 80s and 90s, especially the 1990s, get killed. But as I cut across roads, I always like to find these diners because they remind me of the fantasies I had in high school. And so the Red Rose Diner, as I found out today when I came in, many years ago, I'm estimating about 20 years ago, for many summers till recently, I would always make the drive with my wife Janet across from Connecticut to Cattaraugus, New York, which sits just north of Jamestown, that area, between Buffalo and Jamestown.
Right.
And we take different routes. You take a lot of times 5 and 20 to parallel the New York Thruway and go that way, or we would take the Southern Tier Expressway, and of course I'd look for old diners, and I found them in Auburn and in Herkimer and in Little Falls and in Newark, New York, and of course in Albany and in Monticello, and in Elmira, Horseheads, a beautiful, Silk City Diner from the late 1930s. Silk City Diner.
That's a familiar name, right?
Yes, the Sullivan. It was owned by the people who owned the Sullivan Trucking Company.
Oh,
and what they did, they had their headquarters in Horseheads, and apparently the couple, when they were young, used to go to that diner when it was in Elmira. So they bought the diner and moved it to Horseheads, and then along the Southern Tier, there was a diner in Binghamton. I don't know if it's still there or not, called the Red Robin, and of course then I drive along Route 6, Wellsboro. Of course, I found several diners in Northwest Pennsylvania, Union City, the Union City Diner, spelled D-I-N-O-R. How they spell it? Two, and then one in Erie, Pennsylvania, an old late 1930s Silk City, which I think is still there.
I've heard of that one. We have
which is also on the American. I think they keep it up.
Okay.
It's in excellent shape. Fredonia, and then believe it or not, in Lisbon, Ohio, there's a 1950s, and I'm trying to remember if it's a Mountain View or a Coleman or I can't remember the make, but it's an all-metal classic 50s diner, and I know if I checked my notes I would remember, and shame on me, but it's and that owner keeps that all in the original condition, and it's called the Trolley Stop Diner, etc. I just had lunch there, but they so I look for these kind of joints, as I go, and I've been for years now, and I love another interest, very close interest of mine is doing dusk and night photography in small urban centers of the Northeast, Great Lakes Northeast area of the United States. So consequently, you run into a diner that has late hours, and I enjoy that. You know, individual on-site diners. A place called Patty's Place in Thomaston, Connecticut. Um, a beautiful Mountain View diner in Middletown called O'Rourke's. You know, it was in exquisite condition.
How do you spell
original.
that?
O apostrophe.
O'Rourke's?
O'Rourke's, yeah.
O'Rourke's, okay.
O apostrophe capital ROURKE apostrophe S, I believe.
Okay.
And he, a few years ago, had a bad fire. I think a cheeseburger warmer, whatever, was left on by the help. Started a fire and gutted the diner. He was uninsured, and it was too bad because his diner was very popular. It was Brian O'Rourke, who loves his diner. Is one incredible chef, influenced by a lot of the Cajun and New Orleans cooking. But thanks to the community and people who loved him, people helped him raise money, and he rebuilt that diner.
Really? That's a story in itself, right?
Oh God, you go online and look at O'Rourke's, and he rebuilt that diner, and got donations from Wesleyan, as far as Booth Wesleyan University. You know, people from around came, and he rebuilt that diner, and you know, he had fundraisers, etc. So he is a very generous man in the community. Always gives a tremendous amount to charities, I believe, and so.
I'm glad that you stopped only if in fact you get a chance to do some bonding with Mike Engel, who I mentioned, who's really promoted diners, and he's a good contact for you guys. You can get a lot from each other, I think. In
Mike Engel.
Engel.
Yeah, we'll definitely.
And he has your information right now.
Excellent.
And I'll definitely make sure he follows up with you and vice versa, because, like I said, he's responsible for a lot of diners, you know, happening, and you know, it's amazing the passion that you and Mike, and of course Gordon, who saved probably 3 or 4 diners at least in his life, and put his heart and soul into it, at living in I would say sacrificing, but he loves people, and like I said, I'm here essentially enjoying my conversation with you and hearing your story, and it's a beautiful thing that a diner can actually bring people together, and they can discuss these things. But like I said, you're above and beyond the average person from the standpoint of just your passion for this thing. So we're really happy to have you. And where do you see, like, I mean, you're looking to possibly, you're going to do a book eventually, I hope?
I like to do a book. Definitely, you know, a number of problems happen. We photographers, for instance. I also draw and paint, you know, the American landscape.
That's what I was going to get to, yeah.
But let's speaking about photography. We photographers I believe, are our own worst editors. Okay, so we're obviously very emotionally attached, so you have to step away. I now have my master's degree, you know, in a fine art, and I've learned over the years how to be very, you know, critical, self-critical in a constructive way, you know, of looking at an image. And you know, I've spent, of course, a tremendous amount of, you know, hours, you know, working in the art, and I've had some very strong, you know, professors, and I keep in touch with a professor I had at Ohio State by the name of James Friedman, who I believe is an extremely brilliant photographer in his own right, and he's I'm going to hire him to help me edit. I mean, the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands of color slides, which I'm now scanning, and black and white negatives. I still shoot with film as well as digital, of my roadside American, of what I call the American cultural landscape. If somebody asks me, what do I do? I photograph the American cultural landscape. Diners being a big part of that, obviously, because I love the 20th century. And you know, there's a lot to learn about diners. There's many of us who have loved diners because of that renaissance, you know, in diners. But diners for me are a big part of this larger interest in the American cultural landscape. And I'd love to do several books, but one on my dusk and night photography, and then one just on my journeys across America, and with this homesickness I have for the 20th century, in this, you know, to understand the psychology of my particular images. You know, there's, I believe, a certain quietness, a certain melancholiness, a certain uneasiness, with them, a certain bit of anxiety, just with a sense of composition and the stillness I'll have. A lot of abandoned, dispossessed, rundown places that I'm very interested in. Yet, then the resurrection of the diner, because the diner for me always, as a psychologist from Harvard University, I believe Harvard had talked about why do people like the American diner? What's distinct about the American diner? And you had just said it. It's one of the few places in America where strangers could come in and sit down and talk to each other and not feel that they're invading each other's space. Yeah. That a diner there's a home feeling to a diner. And I think like many others who like diners, fantasize about living close to one where you can always show up on a winter morning on a Sunday, waltz in and sit down and spend 3 hours at your counter seat or booth seat with breakfast, talking with other people with your countless refills of coffee.
When we get a blizzard,
yes,
the news media comes in here and interviews, and of course she's Betty Roof comes in here, God bless her, 5 o'clock in the morning every day, right? And it's so bad that the road department picks her up. She has no excuse not to come in. They'll actually go get her out near Rome,
I love
drag her rump out of the house, and drive her to work because they want to get fed.
Right. Good for them. See, this is and what I always have the fantasy that I would have a studio that's very, very close to a diner. And of course, the older the diner, and with its authenticity, the better, of course. But a diner that would be in a small urban town, and always the fantasy has it that it would be very close or next to a railway yard or a rail line, and that about every 30 minutes a big, huge freight train comes barreling through. And just something about the sound of the train horn and the rumbling freight cars and the metal to medical. I love being around railway yards. If people look at my drawing, I always pick places to draw so that I'm within sight shot or earshot, but certainly sight shot of a railway line. And of course, that's growing up in Youngstown, Ohio, with the dozens and dozens and dozens of freight trains that used to roll through there. And but to me, that's a perfect life. I think that's my heaven. And so I could be painting at 3 o'clock in the morning, put down my brush, come down, go to an all-night diner, sit and talk with a cup of coffee at the booth, with the marble countertop and the tile floor and the smell of the wood.